At Capitol Hill, with over 7 million viewers glued to the screen, Jasmine Crockett and Senator Josh Hawley collide in a high-stakes battle over America's deadliest crisis, violence in the poorest communities. Hawley tries to blame moral decay, but just minutes later, Crockett detonates his argument with damning evidence from his own forgotten counties. Towns ravaged by opioids, abandoned by jobs, and ignored by him. The chamber freezes, his narrative crumbles, and across the country, jaws drop. What if the man preaching morality was the one who let his own people bleed? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill, room 226, wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like one. Mahogany panels glowed under the glare of cameras aimed like sniper scopes at the dais. The air buzzed with anticipation, a hum of power sharpening its edge. 7 million Americans were watching live. Senator Josh Hawley sat upright, tie crisp, jaw locked, rehearsed like a man ready to deliver a guilty verdict. He wasn't here to discuss policy. He was here for theater, for the clip that would go viral before noon. Behind him, aides clutched phones, ready to post the exact moment he cornered his opponent. But across from him sat someone he hadn't counted on. Representative Jasmine Crockett, calm, silent, turning pages in a thick binder, not to strike back, but to honor the names of those silenced long before this hearing. She stood out in every way, too bold, too direct, too unapologetically clear. She didn't come to blend in. Her pearl earrings were armor. Her indigo blazer defied the room's grayscale conformity. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't have to. She flew in overnight, skipped the glad-handing dinner, and studied through turbulence. Not for votes, but for the people in her district who never get a second chance. People evicted, ignored, criminalized. As Hawley prepared to turn urban America into his political punching bag, Crockett remained perfectly still, her silence heavy with purpose. She wasn't waiting to respond. She was preparing to break the narrative. Every screen in the country showed the same frame. A black congresswoman sitting alone on one side of the table, surrounded by men who had already written the script for her. The trap was familiar. Hawley had used it before. Framed cities as crime-ridden, broken, unworthy. Blame progressive policies, say personal responsibility like it was a weapon. And when the camera pans, make sure the face next to that accusation looks like hers. It wasn't just about race. It was about perception, about feeding an audience that wanted to believe that cities like hers were doomed because people like her were in charge. She could see it unfolding in real time. Every pause choreographed, every question rehearsed. But what Hawley didn't realize was that Crockett hadn't come to play defense. She had come to unwrite the script. Then, like the snap of a gavel before a sentence, it came. Hawley shifted in his chair, fingers steepled, voice controlled to the point of cruelty. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his tone dipped in civility, but edged with steel. "You've asked this body more than once for increased funding to cities like Dallas and Chicago. Yet violence continues. Gun crimes are rising. Streets are less safe. So I ask you plainly, what do you say to the families who've lost their children to bullets under policies you've championed? What do you say to the mother who laid her son to rest because leaders like you made their cities unlivable?" It didn't echo. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was sharper than any sound. Every staffer paused mid-pen. One senator blinked, stunned by the bluntness. Cameras zoomed slightly, as if the lens itself had recoiled. The room hadn't gone quiet because of reverence, but because of shock. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as inquiry, a political bullet loaded and fired in plain sight. Hawley hadn't asked because he wanted an answer. He asked to pin a death toll on a woman's shoulders and hope she buckled. He didn't mention the bills he voted against, those meant to fund community intervention, youth employment, or housing stabilization. He didn't mention the millions stripped from schools or the hollowed-out budgets that left public safety to fray like threadbare rope. He didn't mention how many times she had stood alone, fighting to stop cities from being starved of resources, only to be dismissed as playing politics. Now he sat there demanding an explanation for wounds his own hands helped carve, and across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not blink. She didn't rush to answer, didn't shift in her seat, but her jaw tightened, just slightly. Her binder lay open before her, names and faces in black ink, each one a life she'd carried into that room. She wasn't just hearing Hawley's words. She was hearing the ghosts behind them. The students lost to stray bullets, the single mothers who slept with furniture against their doors, the fathers who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on. This wasn't a debate about policy. It was a test of whether she'd let her community be turned into political theater. Whether she'd stand silent while a man who had never walked those streets used their grief as a stepping stone. But Jasmine Crockett knew what this was. It was a setup, a provocation, a moment designed to paint her district as a failure and herself as its symbol. And yet, in the stillness of that second, she made a decision. If they were going to invoke her people's pain, then she was going to speak in a language they couldn't erase. Truth, data, and memory. Josh Hawley had come for blood, but what he'd just done was awaken something far more dangerous. A woman who remembered everything and had nothing left to prove. But Hawley hadn't landed the blow he thought he had. His words hung in the air like smoke from a spent cartridge, meant to choke, to linger, to stain. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. No flash of outrage, no flicker of wounded pride. Instead, she looked at him, slowly, deliberately, like a surgeon studying a wound she'd seen too many times before. Her expression was unreadable, her body language composed with the kind of stillness that makes people lean in, anticipating the explosion that never comes. The cameras caught it, every second of her silence, every beat of control. Her eyes, dark and direct, didn't blink as she absorbed the weight of his accusation. There was no panic, just precision. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It sank deeper and heavier than any yell. "Senator," she began, each syllable slow and measured, like the draw of breath before a storm. "I'm actually glad you asked that question." Her hands folded calmly on the desk in front of her, but her words cut sharper than any rebuttal. "Because it gives me a chance to say something my constituents have been waiting over 20 years to hear echoed in these halls." The room didn't move. Not a paper rustled, not a throat cleared. Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, not to attack, but to deliver a truth with surgical clarity. They've watched hearing after hearing, budget after budget, where their pain was politicized, where their suffering was reduced to statistics or punchlines. Never humanity. Her voice stayed even, but her gaze was steel. "And today, I get to speak that truth into this record, not because you allowed it, but because I refuse to let it be ignored any longer." She paused, not for effect, but to let oxygen back into the room. And in that breathless moment, something shifted. Hawley's smirk faltered, just slightly, the corner of his jaw tightening. Because he realized then, this wasn't a woman who came to play defense. This was someone who had turned survival into strategy, and she had just taken control of the room without raising her voice, without even standing. The strike he'd planned had missed its mark. What he'd awakened instead was the quiet force of a woman who had buried enough neighbors to know that silence doesn't mean surrender. It means restraint. And now that restraint was about to break. And just when the hearing room thought it had heard the worst, Jasmine Crockett leaned in, voice still calm, but now impossibly heavier, and pulled the curtain back on a reality most people in that chamber had never been forced to see. "Senator, you asked what I would say to the families who've lost their children," she began, and her tone made it clear this wasn't rhetorical. "So I'm going to tell you about Letitia." She didn't check her notes. She didn't need to. This story wasn't printed. It was etched into her memory. Letitia is a single mother in South Dallas. She works the overnight shift cleaning hospital floors so her son could have what she never did. Safety, stability, a shot at a better life. His name was Davian. He was 13 years old. He wanted to be a civil engineer, loved math, laughed with his whole face. Crockett's voice held, but her throat moved once, just once, before she continued. 2 months ago, Davian was shot while waiting for the school bus. Not at 2 a.m., not on some corner during a drug deal. At 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, wearing his backpack and holding his geometry homework. She paused just long enough for that image to settle into the minds of those listening. The streetlight at that corner hadn't worked since 2020. The security camera in front of the corner store was shattered. The school he used to attend was closed due to budget cuts. So now he had to travel 2 neighborhoods over, through an area riddled with abandoned buildings, with no after-school programs, no patrol officers, no working infrastructure. And when Letitia filed to move out 3 times, once through the city, once through the Federal Housing Authority, once through emergency relocation, she was told each time, "We're backlogged." No urgency, no help, no way out. Crockett now looked up, and her voice, though not louder, carried more force. "So you ask me what I'd say to her? I already have. I sat in her kitchen at a table with a broken leg, holding her hand while she tried to explain to her youngest son why his big brother wasn't coming home. I say to her what I wish someone had said before the cameras were turned on, that her son didn't die because of lenient policies. He died because for decades, people in power decided his life didn't matter enough to invest in. They let his neighborhood crumble. They let his school close. They let his mother beg for help and gave her silence in return. Her gaze didn't waver, not once. And now, after all that abandonment, after all that neglect, the same leaders who voted down the funding, who stripped the social programs, who blocked housing reform, dare to show up and blame her? The room was still. No one reached for their water. No one checked their phone. Jasmine Crockett had taken a single child's death and peeled it back to reveal an entire system's failure. And what made it unbearable was that it was true. And then, as if none of it mattered, none of the blood, none of the names, none of the tears Josh Hawley would never have to wipe from a mother's face, he leaned back in his chair with the comfort of a man who had never once paid a price for someone else's suffering. He laced his fingers together, tilted his chin, and said with a half smile, "You know, Congresswoman, I grew up in a small town too. We didn't have federal grants. We didn't have special funding. But we still knew how to hold on to our values." The words dropped like oil on water, slick, self-assured, and detached from the fire beneath them. Then came the turn, smooth as it was cruel. "So maybe what's happening in places like yours isn't about resources. Maybe it's a cultural problem." He said it without blinking, as if poverty was a personality trait, as if funerals were a lifestyle choice, as if communities like Crockett's had simply forgotten how to be decent. The room shifted, slowly, subtly. One staffer in the back let out a low exhale that could have been a scoff or a laugh. Another leaned over to whisper something into a colleague's ear. Several heads nodded, not in agreement with policy, but with the comfort of having their biases confirmed by someone with a microphone. It was the kind of moment that didn't need applause to land. It fed on complicity, on the silent agreement of those who already believed the worst about people they'd never bothered to understand. Hawley's words didn't just undermine Crockett's argument. They erased the system entirely, replacing cause and consequence with stereotype and superiority. And that was the cruelty buried inside his civility. He didn't challenge the facts. He dismissed the reality. He reduced decades of systemic neglect, of redlining, school closures, broken infrastructure, underfunded hospitals, housing deserts, lead in the water, mold on the ceilings, to a lack of moral character. He implied that if Crockett's constituents had just tried harder, prayed louder, or acted more like his people, they wouldn't be burying children. It was an old tactic, dressed up in polite rhetoric. But underneath, it was the same old lie, that suffering is earned and privilege is proof of virtue. And in that moment, with a smirk and a shrug, Hawley didn't just insult Jasmine Crockett. He insulted every name in her binder, every child who never made it to adulthood, every mother still waiting for a call that will never come. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes the way the room half expected her to. She didn't offer outrage. She offered proof. With the same quiet composure she'd carried since the hearing began, she reached into her binder and pulled out a document. One page, crisp and carefully highlighted, the official seal of the U.S. Department of Justice stamped clearly in the corner. She laid it flat on the desk before her, slid it forward just far enough for the camera to catch it, then looked up at Hawley, not with defiance, but with surgical intent. Since we're measuring morality, she said, her voice low and steady, let's start with numbers. Her hand hovered briefly over the bolded line in yellow. This is a federal report from 2024. It shows that domestic violence rates in rural Missouri, your state, have surpassed those in every major metropolitan area in the country. Not by a little, by 23%. No one laughed this time. The smiles died. Pens froze mid-word. The room, which only moments ago echoed with quiet approval, was now still as stone. Crockett didn't raise her voice, because the truth didn't need volume. It needed space to settle. I've read through it line by line, she continued. Boone County, Gasconade, Washington County, places where shelters are overrun, where victims have no access to support services, and where your office has consistently voted against funding the very programs that could help them. She leaned in slightly, not confrontational, but unwavering. You want to talk about values? About culture? Fine. Let's talk about what it means to be trapped in a home with your abuser, because the nearest crisis center is 70 miles away, and your broadband doesn't work well enough to call for help. Then came the pivot, slow, intentional, and devastating. Because poverty, Senator, does not check your voting record before it shows up. It doesn't ask if you're red or blue. It doesn't care if your front yard has a flag or a foreclosure notice. It finds you. Whether you're living in a roach-infested apartment in South Dallas or a mobile home in Dent County. She didn't look at the chairwoman, didn't scan the audience. Her focus stayed locked, not just on Hawley, but on the invisible wall he'd tried to build between her constituents and his. And morality, she said, her voice like a scalpel now. It doesn't live in small towns or big cities. It doesn't favor churches over shelters or country roads over urban blocks. It lives or dies based on what we're willing to fund, protect, and fight for. Then she paused and delivered the line that pierced the silence like thunder. Poverty doesn't recognize zip codes, and morality doesn't live on a voting map. No one moved. The temperature in the room had changed, not from heat, but from clarity. Crockett had taken the lie Hawley wrapped in nostalgia and peeled it apart until all that remained was a truth too plain to ignore. That suffering doesn't belong to one party, one region, or one race. And the only real divide is who gets shamed for it and who gets saved. And if there was still anyone in that hearing room clinging to the false comfort that these problems were limited to cities like Dallas or Detroit, Jasmine Crockett dismantled that illusion with clinical precision. Her voice, calm but resolute, carried the quiet force of someone who didn't need to yell to be undeniable. She turned to the next section of her binder, marked in red, not for drama, but for urgency. Let's talk about Missouri, Senator, she said evenly. Not hypothetically, not in campaign slogans. Let's talk about the counties you were elected to protect. She flipped the page and read aloud without glancing at Hawley. Pulaski County, home to thousands of military families. Over 40% of children there lack reliable internet access, which means they fall behind before they ever step into a classroom. And when schools go remote, they disappear completely. No broadband, no tablets, just silence. She didn't pause for reaction. She kept going, faster now, like peeling bandages off wounds the room would rather ignore. Reynolds County, opioid overdoses up 400% in the past 5 years. One pharmacist for every 2,000 residents. No detox center. No mental health clinic within a 50-mile radius. Her fingers didn't shake, but her voice thickened slightly. St. Francois County, where children are being raised by grandparents because both parents are lost to fentanyl or prison. Where job training programs were slashed by the state. Where local food banks report they're serving people with full-time jobs who still can't afford milk. She turned one more page. And Ripley County, no full-service grocery store since 2021. The nearest hospital with a working maternity unit, 90 minutes away. Now she looked up, eyes locking with Hawley's. The power in her delivery came not from anger, but from the unbearable weight of truth delivered without embellishment. These are your counties, Senator, your people. You represent them in name. But when they suffer, you vanish in silence. You say the problem is cultural, I say it's legislative. You say it's about values. I say it's about resources. You say they just need to work harder, while voting against every single program that might give them a chance to breathe. The room was no longer neutral. It was caught somewhere between discomfort and revelation. Crockett hadn't attacked his record. She had exposed his absence. And more than that, she had drawn a direct, unflinching line between the neglected children of rural Missouri and the silenced voices of her own district. Different landscapes, same abandonment. And this time, someone had the courage to say it out loud. But just as Crockett's final words settled like thunder over the room, Josh Hawley straightened in his chair, cleared his throat, and tried to regain control. Not of the facts, but of the narrative. He leaned into his microphone, voice smooth but strained, wearing the kind of forced composure that only shows up when a man realizes the ground beneath him is no longer solid. With all due respect, he began, the familiar shield of deflection already raised, these are deeply complex problems. We cannot pretend that a single piece of legislation or a funding bill will magically resolve decades of decline. His tone grew tighter, more defensive with every syllable. There are cultural dynamics at play, personal choices, family structures, communities that have to take ownership of their own futures. He shifted in his seat, hands clasped a little too tightly, knuckles pale. Throwing more money at broken systems hasn't fixed anything. We need to get back to the values that built this country. Self-reliance, personal responsibility, local solutions. A few heads nodded, tired reflexes from those who didn't want to follow where Crockett's truth had led. But the tension in the room didn't ease. If anything, it grew more brittle. Hawley's words weren't answers. They were retreat. He wasn't responding to the data. He was retreating into ideology, as if Crockett had come with a theory and not with names, counties, numbers, and graves. As if her evidence could be brushed aside by nostalgia masquerading as policy. We've seen what happens, Hawley continued, when the federal government tries to run every local community from Washington. It doesn't work. We empower families by getting Washington out of the way, not by writing bigger checks. His smile was slight, but it didn't reach his eyes, because he knew, and everyone watching knew, that he hadn't dismantled her argument. He had simply refused to carry its weight. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to let Senator Hawley retreat behind platitudes and vague ideals without being held accountable for the concrete harm he'd helped cause. As soon as he leaned on the old narrative of personal responsibility and local solutions, she reached again for her binder, not for effect, but for evidence. Senator, she said, her voice low but deliberate, we're not talking about abstract theories. We're talking about your votes, your choices, your record. She flipped open a marked tab and pulled out a short list, not of talking points, but of bills Hawley had personally opposed. You voted no on the COVID Community Recovery Fund. That was a bill designed to send targeted relief to the neighborhoods hit hardest by the pandemic, many of them in your own state, places where hospitals overflowed and businesses collapsed. You said it was too expensive. She turned another page, her voice steady but cutting. You voted no on the Affordable Housing for Homeless Veterans Act. That bill would have built and restored permanent housing for men and women who wore the same uniform you claim to respect. It wasn't just about shelter, it was about restoring dignity. But you said it was wasteful spending. A third page, another silence. And you voted no on the Rural Student Mental Health Support Act. That legislation would have placed licensed counselors in under-resourced schools in counties where suicide rates among teens are climbing. Places where the nearest therapist is an hour's drive away, if the family even has a car. Then she looked up, not with anger, but with a calm so controlled it felt like a loaded weapon. And now you sit here and ask why people in those same communities are struggling? She said, voice tightening just enough to draw the room closer. You can't vote against clean water and then shake your head when people get sick. You can't gut housing programs and then pretend to be shocked by rising homelessness. You can't block funding for mental health and then call it a culture problem when kids take their own lives. She let that sit for just a beat. Then, you don't get to take away the oxygen and blame people for not knowing how to swim. There was no need to raise her voice, Because in that moment, the entire room had already drowned in the weight of what she'd just exposed. The weight of the data had been delivered. The hypocrisy had been named. The room was still reeling when Jasmine Crockett, without shifting her tone or breaking her rhythm, did something no chart or policy paper could ever accomplish. She made it personal. Her voice lowered, not from weakness, but from the quiet force of memory. "Let me tell you why I fight the way I do," she said, folding her hands as if steadying something inside herself. "When I was 14, my family lost our home, not because we didn't pay rent, but because we were locked out of opportunity from the start. My parents worked. They did everything they were supposed to, but the housing authority in our area prioritized new developments over existing communities. They called it revitalization. But to us, it was eviction with a pretty name. The words didn't crack, but they carried the weight of something lived, not studied. We lived in a truck for 3 months," she continued, her eyes now scanning the room, daring anyone to look away. "A red Chevy Suburban. My mother kept our clothes folded in plastic bins in the trunk. We parked in church lots, behind gas stations, sometimes outside a Walmart where the lights stayed on through the night. I did my homework in the front seat, using the dashboard as a desk. I washed my school uniform at a laundromat on Jefferson Street, paid for in quarters my dad saved from tips. There was no dramatization, no swelling violins, just the kind of quiet, vivid truth that makes even the most hardened policy wonk forget their bullet points. I remember sitting under a street lamp trying to finish a practice exam by the deadline, because the public library closed at 6. I remember being too ashamed to tell my friends why I always said I'll get a ride, because there was no house to go home to. The hearing room remained silent, not out of politeness, but because the air had shifted again. The committee chamber had become something it rarely did, a place of reckoning. Crockett didn't cry. She didn't pause for pity. She spoke like someone who had carried that version of herself, 14, tired and terrified, into every hearing, every vote, every fight. "This wasn't 30 years ago in some forgotten corner of the country," she said, her voice growing sharper. "This was Texas. This was the United States of America. And it happened not because my family failed, but because the system that was supposed to help us was designed to ignore us." She glanced at the senators before her, eyes steady. The housing wait list had 1,000 names on it. The only open units were in neighborhoods so neglected they didn't have functioning streetlights. My mother asked for a fair chance. What she got was a shrug and a stack of paperwork that led nowhere. Then she leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the full presence of someone stepping into their power. "So when you sit here and accuse communities like mine of lacking values, or say that help won't make a difference, understand this. I've lived the version of America you pretend doesn't exist. I've watched my parents break their backs only to be treated like burdens. I've gone to school hungry and returned to a car that doubled as a bedroom. So no, I don't speak for the poor," she said, her voice low but ferocious now. "I am the poor. I was that child, and I didn't claw my way into this chair to play respectability politics. I'm here so no one else has to carry their trauma in silence." A pause, just long enough for it all to land. Then she said the words that would echo far beyond the walls of room 226. "I don't speak for the poor. I am them. And I'm sitting in this seat to make damn sure they're never erased again." No one moved. No one dared. Because in that moment, she hadn't just spoken. She'd held up a mirror and forced the whole room to look. The silence in the room had shifted from tense to suffocating. It wasn't just the quiet of decorum. It was the kind of silence that followed a collapse, when all the scaffolding holding up a narrative finally gave way. Senator Josh Hawley sat still, no longer in control of the conversation, no longer the commanding voice in the room. His eyes dropped to the table in front of him, but it wasn't to review notes. There was nothing left to review. His fingers, once confidently tapping out points in rhythm with his rhetoric, now rested still and pale, pressed flat against the desk. He didn't look at Jasmine Crockett. He couldn't. There was no lifeline coming. No staffer daring to whisper guidance. No camera cutting away to distract from what had just happened. For the first time since the hearing began, Hawley wasn't speaking. He was hiding. Behind silence, behind posture, behind the hope that maybe if he looked down long enough, this moment would pass. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. Not because she wanted to humiliate him, but because she couldn't allow what he represented to walk out of that room unchallenged. She stood still, centered in herself, her breathing calm but deliberate, like someone standing at the edge of something irreversible. Then, in a move that felt less like a gesture and more like a statement of purpose, she turned to face the camera. Not Hawley, not the chair, but the American public. The blinking red light that signaled millions were watching didn't intimidate her. It invited her, and she accepted. Her voice, when it came, was not raised. It was steady, clearer than any sound that had echoed in that room all morning. They call people like me the problem, she said, but people like him? She didn't point, didn't need to. They call that a symbol, a leader, a patriot. That's not morality. That's bias, dressed up in politics and passed down like tradition. The words didn't ricochet. They sank, like lead dropped into deep water. The kind of truth that makes a room remember its walls. No one moved, not out of respect, but out of the dawning realization that something irreversible had just been said, that a line had been drawn, not in anger, but in reality, one that exposed the rot beneath the language of decency, civility, and culture. Crockett hadn't accused him of lying. She had accused the entire system of hypocrisy, and proven it, because her voice didn't carry the weight of theory. It carried the weight of someone who had survived what others only talked about. Her words weren't aimed at headlines. They were aimed at history, at every child who had been told their zip code defined their worth, at every parent who had worked 3 jobs and still been blamed for failing, at every town, rural or urban, left to fend for itself while politicians passed the blame like a talking point. She stood still after she spoke, giving the moment no cushion to fall on, no soft landing, just truth, left to stand on its own. And in that brutal honesty, she reclaimed something few in that room even realized had been lost: the right to speak without apology, to testify without permission, to stand in power not because someone gave it to her, but because she took it and brought everyone else with her. Josh Hawley didn't respond. Couldn't. Because what response could there be when the question wasn't asked for debate, but for documentation? When the answer had already been lived, not theorized. And so he remained silent, eyes still lowered, hands still clasped. The senator who moments ago had tried to define the conversation with hollow certainty now sat eclipsed by a woman who had nothing left to prove. No one in that room said a word, not because they disagreed, but because they knew she was right. And just as the chamber tried to steady itself beneath the weight of what had been said, a quiet motion occurred in the third row, almost invisible at first, but history rarely announces itself in volume. A young congressional staffer, barely past their 20s, sat stiff with a government-issued phone clenched in hand. They hadn't meant to record anything that day. Their job was to take notes, monitor committee time, and pass memos when needed. But something about the way the air had changed in that hearing, thick, still, electric, told them this wasn't just another round of political theater. It was something else, something true. So with a single breath, they unlocked their screen, angled the lens upward, and hit record. Hands trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the understanding that they were witnessing a fracture in the narrative. Crockett didn't know the camera had locked onto her. She wasn't performing. She was testifying. Her eyes didn't seek applause. They sought the edge of the truth. And then came the line. Quiet, steady, but loaded like a hammer in slow motion. You don't get to stand on a podium and preach morality while voting against the very survival of the people underneath it. The words didn't echo. They sank, slow, leaden, inescapable. No one spoke. No one dared. Even the official court reporter paused slightly before typing, as if giving the sentence room to live on its own. It wasn't just a call-out. It was an indictment. Not of one man, but of a system that had long hidden behind the speeches while pulling the rug from under those with nothing left to lose. The sentence didn't require context. It was the context, condensed, sharpened, and impossible to ignore. The staffer held the phone steady, their own breath catching in their throat. They weren't thinking of retweets or headlines. They were thinking of their mother back in a rural town in Kentucky who worked two jobs after their father overdosed. They were thinking of how many times they had heard people like Crockett dismissed as angry, loud, divisive, when in fact, they were the only ones willing to name the wound out loud. As Crockett's words settled over the room, something subtle but irreversible took place. The power in the space shifted, not in form but in focus. It was no longer about who had the mic, it was about who had the truth. And now that truth was caught, on video in real time, framed by no spin, no editing, no apology. Just a black congresswoman, standing inside an institution that had never been built for her, refusing to let silence be the final word. The blinking red light on the phone continued as she turned back to her binder. Calm, unmoved, complete. She hadn't just spoken for the voiceless, she had reminded the powerful that silence is no longer theirs to control. And on a borrowed phone, in the hands of someone no one would remember, the most important 7 seconds of that hearing had just been preserved, for everyone who'd spent a lifetime being erased. And from that single unedited clip, captured not by a news network, but by the unshaken hands of a stunned staffer, the spark began to catch fire. Within minutes, the footage, just 21 seconds long, was posted quietly to a personal account on TikTok, with no caption, no filter, no branding. Just raw footage of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's voice piercing through decades of silence. The algorithm didn't hesitate. By the time the staffer logged out of the app and walked out of room 226, the view count had already passed 100,000. By the time they reached the elevator, it had crossed 1 million. The comment section exploded, not with noise but with recognition. Nurses on break, veterans in diners, single mothers between shifts all hitting send and share, tagging friends with one word: listen. On Twitter, the clip surfaced under a new hashtag, Moral Fail Not Mine, posted by a high school civics teacher who wrote, "This is what accountability sounds like." Moments later, a community organizer in Chicago added Crockett truth, and within hours it was trending nationally. The quote, "You don't get to stand on a podium and preach morality while voting against survival," was shared with captions like, "Finally someone said it, and this isn't just politics. This is personal." On TikTok, teenagers stitched the clip with footage of closed school libraries, broken street lamps, eviction notices taped to front doors. One viral reply showed an elderly man in Arkansas watching the video in tears, whispering, "She's talking about us. She's talking about me." The evening news couldn't ignore it. Not this time. What had started as a low-profile subcommittee hearing now led every hour. Crockett confronts Hawley in viral floor moment. Major anchors, many of whom had barely mentioned her name before, suddenly quoted her line with tones of awe, confusion, or both. On cable news, panelists stumbled to reframe what had happened, calling it a breakdown in messaging or an emotional outburst, but viewers had already seen the truth with their own eyes. No script, no stagecraft, just a woman standing her ground with nothing but facts, memory, and fire. And still, the clip kept climbing. Community centers projected it on brick walls. Students played it during debate club meetings. Activists cut the audio into protest videos. Even overseas, journalists and public figures in the UK, South Africa, and Brazil picked it up, calling Crockett's testimony a mirror held to every democracy that hides its cruelty behind ceremony. On Reddit, a former federal housing employee wrote, "I've sat in on these hearings for 10 years. I've never seen anyone speak like that," and survived the silence afterward, because that's what made it so explosive. Not the sound, but what followed it, a chamber that had nothing left to say. And behind it all, the hashtags did more than trend. They became banners held up by people who had never been invited into the conversation before. People who had long been told to wait, to sit quietly, to accept moral lectures from those who had never once lived with the consequences of their policies. Jasmine Crockett's words didn't just go viral, they unlocked something, a collective understanding, a shared fury, a quiet rising power that was tired of asking for permission to be heard. And now that the story had broken through, no headline could control it. No party could claim it. And no senator, especially not Josh Hawley, could ever again say they hadn't been told the truth. 2 days later, long after the headlines had shifted and the hashtags were swallowed by the next viral wave, the real story continued, quietly where it always had, in rooms without microphones. The transition from viral sensation to real-world connection wasn't marked by a CNN segment or a retweet from a celebrity. It was marked by folding chairs in a drafty hall on the south side of Dallas. No press, no podium, just a creaking floor, a drip from a loose ceiling pipe, and the scent of stale coffee in a plastic dispenser. Jasmine Crockett arrived the way she always had in her district, not with an entourage, but with a binder under her arm and her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She moved through the crowd like a neighbor, not a headline. People didn't rush her. They watched her. Some had seen the clip. Others had only heard. But all of them had the same question written across their faces. Did any of it matter? The walls of the community center were faded, the paint chipped from years of use, and not enough funding. Handwritten signs for after-school programs were taped alongside flyers for eviction defense hotlines. Kids darted in and out from a side room where someone had donated coloring books. Elders sat in the front row, backs straight despite decades of work, watching Crockett not like an official, but like a daughter who had made it out and come back. She greeted them all the same way she had in courtrooms and kitchens and gas station parking lots, with a voice that didn't pretend. Then she stood at the front, not on a stage, just near a folding table where the coffee sat half full, and took questions. The man who stood up was maybe in his late 60s. His shirt was clean but worn, collar frayed. The type of man who'd worked the same job for 40 years until the plant closed and the benefits vanished behind a corporate merger. He didn't speak like a man looking for drama. He spoke like someone who had carried disappointment for so long and no longer cracked his voice. "I saw what you said," he began. "Watched it twice, maybe 3 times. I didn't think they'd let you finish, but you did." The room chuckled lightly, but then his voice steadied. "My question is simple, ma'am. Did it change anything? I mean, did it really change anything?" The pause that followed wasn't dramatic. It was sacred, because it was the question everyone wanted to ask, but never knew how. Crockett didn't answer right away. She looked at him the way one looks at someone they've met before, even if they haven't. Then she took a slow breath, stepped forward, and met the moment not with a political line, but with something far riskier: honesty. "No," she said softly, "I don't think it changed them." She let the words sit, not to deflate hope, but to clear room for something real. But it changed something else. Her eyes scanned the room, not the ceiling, not the floor, them. "It made people like you feel seen. It made people like my mother and your neighbors, and that young man who called my office last week, stop wondering if they were invisible." A few nods moved through the chairs like a breeze. "I didn't say those words in that room because I thought they'd listen. I said them because I needed you to hear them." Her tone grew firmer, not louder. "We've been told for decades that our struggles are our fault, that our poverty is a moral failing, that if we just worked harder, prayed harder, waited longer, things would fix themselves. Meanwhile, our neighborhoods were left behind. Our schools were closed. Our rent went up while our wages stayed frozen. And when we cried out, they gave us lectures instead of help." She leaned against the table now, hands braced slightly. "But what I said that day, it wasn't permission. It was a promise. A promise that I will not let them tell our story without us in the room anymore." The man who'd asked the question didn't nod right away. He looked down at his boots for a long second, then back up. "That's all I needed to hear," he said quietly. And in that moment, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was whole. Crockett didn't rush to continue. She didn't pivot to the next question. Instead, she turned and pointed to the side of the room where a whiteboard listed requests from community members: housing issues, school board concerns, denied applications for federal assistance. "This," she said, "is what matters. Not the headlines, not the cameras. This right here. And I didn't go to Washington to be viral. I went to make sure every single thing on that board gets a damn response." She walked toward it and grabbed a dry erase marker, drawing a line underneath the last name, written in faded ink. "No one gets erased," she said. "Not anymore." And in that hall, where the linoleum curled up at the corners and the air conditioner buzzed too loud, something took root. Not change in a sweeping cinematic sense, but something quieter, deeper, belief, not in institutions, but in each other. In the truth that sometimes one sentence, spoken at the right time, in the right place by someone who refused to sit down, was the change. And for the first time in a long time, no one in that room felt like they were on the outside looking in. They were seen, they were heard, and they were finally part of the record. The chairs had been stacked, the clipboards collected, the coffee cold in its plastic dispenser. The community center was quiet now, the kind of quiet that only follows after something true has been said. Jasmine Crockett stood near the whiteboard, her blazer slung over one chair, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scanning the names scribbled in fading marker. A few volunteers remained, chatting softly as they packed up folding tables and bagged up leftover snacks. It had been a long day, but she didn't want to leave just yet. Something about the room felt unfinished. She was halfway through erasing the last line. Eviction hearing, Miss Howard, March 2nd, when it came. A soft, hesitant knock at the side door. Not the front, where attendees had come and gone, but the side, half hidden behind a rack of donated coats and a bulletin board pinned with old job postings. Jasmine turned instinctively. No one else moved. The knock came again, gentle but steady. She crossed the room, heart picking up in a way she couldn't quite name, and pulled the door open. There stood a woman, mid-20s maybe, though the lines under her eyes aged her by a decade. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, frizz curling around her ears. A hospital scrub peeked out beneath an oversized coat. In one arm, she carried a sleeping child, no more than 4, cheeks flushed, head buried into her shoulder. In the other hand, she clutched a thick manila folder. Her grip on it was tight, like she'd rehearsed handing it over too many times and was still waiting for someone to care. I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt," the woman said quietly, her voice rough with exhaustion. "I wasn't at the meeting. I couldn't leave work in time. But I came because I saw what you said on TV. And I didn't know where else to go." Jasmine stepped aside without a word and motioned her in. The woman hesitated, shifting the child's weight slightly, then crossed the threshold like someone entering sacred ground. Jasmine led her to a quiet corner near the now empty snack table. One of the volunteers, seeing the child, quietly fetched a blanket and draped it over a chair. The woman sat slowly, careful not to wake her son. Jasmine pulled up a chair beside her. "My name's Marissa," the woman said, eyes not meeting hers. "This is Elias. He's got asthma. He missed his last 2 appointments because the clinic said they couldn't schedule him without a permanent address on file. I told them we were staying with my cousin, but they said the shelter counted as a different district. I just—" Her voice cracked, not from emotion but from restraint. "I brought this." She slid the folder across the table. Jasmine opened it carefully. Inside were eviction notices, hospital intake forms, a torn food stamp rejection letter, a job application returned with a red stamp that read, "Incomplete proof of address required." There was also a letter, dated 9 months earlier, addressed to a different congressman, requesting help with Section 8 processing delays. The envelope was still inside. It had never been opened. Jasmine didn't ask what happened. She knew. This wasn't a story she had to imagine. It was one she'd lived in variations too many times to count. "I know I'm not from your district," Marissa said, voice barely above a whisper. "I just thought you'd understand. You sounded like you did." Jasmine nodded slowly. "I do." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that felt heavy but safe. Elias stirred slightly in his sleep, letting out a soft breath before settling again. "I work nights," Marissa said suddenly. "I clean floors in the pediatric wing at County General. I walk there from the shelter after Elias falls asleep. Some nights, I don't even clock out before coming back to get him ready for preschool. If they find out I'm using my cousin's address on paperwork again, they'll pull my application." She paused. "I'm not asking for favors. I just want someone to see us." Jasmine reached into her own bag and pulled out a small notebook. Not her official congressional planner, the leather-bound one her aides preferred, Just a beat-up moleskin, corners curled, pages filled with names and numbers. She flipped to a clean page and wrote down Marissa J., Elias, Housing, Medical Access, District 31. "I'm going to make some calls for you," she said softly. "Not promises, not speeches, just calls. The kind that shake trees." Marissa's shoulders trembled, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of not being dismissed. Jasmine closed the folder and handed it back. "Keep this. You might need it again, but next time, you'll have someone else's name on the line too." Marissa nodded, blinking quickly. Then Jasmine did something she rarely did in public. She reached across the table and took the young woman's hand in hers. It wasn't performative. It wasn't political. It was the simplest, oldest form of resistance, human connection. "They've built a system where survival feels like a test," she said, "and they've rigged it so people like you are always just one mistake away from falling through the cracks. But here's the thing. They forgot that cracks let light through, and I intend to let a lot more in." A long silence followed. Marissa rose, still cradling her child. "Thank you," she said, and then after a pause, "not for the help, for seeing us." Jasmine walked her to the door, watched her disappear into the cold night, then returned to her chair. The volunteers had gone. The room was quiet again. She sat for a while, staring at the name still faintly visible on the whiteboard, and wrote one more at the bottom in black marker: Elias, Asthma Clinic, permanent address pending. She put the marker down and whispered to no one, "Not on my watch." And somewhere deep inside her, the fire lit 2 days ago in room 226 burned brighter, because that wasn't a speech she had given. It was a signal. And now people were answering. Washington didn't flinch when the clip first dropped. It rarely does. The Capitol has a way of absorbing outrage like stone absorbs heat, slowly, invisibly, then all at once. Most assumed it would pass. That Jasmine Crockett's fiery rebuke of Senator Josh Hawley would join the endless digital carousel of flash headlines, trending tags, and viral fury burned out by the next morning. 100 members of Congress had said provocative things in committee before, but this wasn't that. This wasn't performance. This was something else. It wasn't until the clip was played, unedited, unspun, on the Senate dining room TV at 7:42 a.m., 2 days later, that it landed with force. The audio was barely up, but the room went quiet the second Crockett's voice rang out from the small screen mounted above the coffee station. "You don't get to stand on a podium and preach morality while voting against the very survival of the people underneath it." Forks hovered. Aides froze mid-text. Across the room, Senator Pauline Marks stopped pouring her coffee and turned to the screen with one eyebrow raised. Senator Lamont, a moderate Democrat from Minnesota, known for dodging culture clashes, exhaled slowly, muttering under his breath, "Damn." At a corner table, Hawley sat alone, his expression unreadable. The room didn't look at him, but it didn't not look at him either. The clip kept playing. The moment Crockett turned to the camera, the quiet in the hearing room, the weight of the words that had hung there like judgment itself. No theatrics, just brutal, measured clarity. A new staffer at the far end of the dining hall whispered, "She didn't blink." Her supervisor didn't reply, because she was right. By midday, Crockett's office had received over 3,000 emails. But what surprised them wasn't the volume. It was the return addresses. They came from places Crockett hadn't even campaigned in. Pikeville, Kentucky, where a retired coal miner wrote, "You said what my union rep used to say before they shut him down. I don't agree with your politics, but you got my respect." Mason County, West Virginia, where a high school guidance counselor said, "Our school has had 3 teen suicides this year. I sent your speech to every staff member I know." Des Moines, Iowa, where a disabled veteran wrote simply, "No one fights for us. You did." Meanwhile, the number Crockett Truth hashtag had morphed from a trending tag into a digital archive. Users uploaded footage of broken schools in Appalachia, drugstore closures in Nebraska. A stitched TikTok showed a classroom in rural Mississippi using a Crockett quote as part of their civics curriculum. Teachers wrote her name on dry erase boards. Teenagers recited her lines from memory. A group of volunteers in Kansas created a website cataloging every bill Hawley had voted against that directly impacted struggling counties, and credited Crockett for inspiring them. And then came the call, not from a news anchor, not from a party boss, from Reverend Elijah Ford, a civil rights icon, living legend. He'd marched with King, he'd buried organizers. He didn't call members of Congress, he summoned them. The voice on Crockett's cell was deep and direct. "Congresswoman, I saw your fire. You lit it where they don't want it burning. Don't let them put it out with ceremony and handshakes." She didn't know how to respond, so she simply said, "Thank you, sir." He replied, "Don't thank me. Finish it." Back in the Capitol, her colleagues began to take notice, not because they were inspired, but because they were nervous. Nervous about how she had spoken truths without asking permission. Nervous about how cleanly she had drawn the lines they'd spent careers smudging. A few whispered in private, "She'll never get another bill out of committee." Others said, "She just tanked her future." One strategist was overheard saying, "That woman doesn't know how to play the game." But Crockett wasn't trying to play it. She was trying to break it open. That afternoon, as she returned to her office, she found a stack of handwritten letters on her desk. Not all were supportive. One read, "You embarrassed this institution. You brought emotion to a place of order. That's not leadership, it's noise." Another, "Stick to your district. Nobody elected you to be the conscience of the chamber." But then there was a letter, handwritten on cheap notebook paper, no return address. It said, "I watch from a hospital bed. I had been thinking about ending things this week, but after hearing you speak, I remember that people like me exist. You reminded me I'm not broken. I'm just surviving." Crockett held that letter longer than the rest. Later that evening, on a floor vote concerning school nutrition programs, she crossed paths with Hawley. He didn't look at her, didn't nod, but as they passed, he said under his breath, "You made your point." She didn't stop walking, but she did reply without turning her head, "It wasn't for you." Outside the chamber, reporters waited, microphones angled, but Crockett didn't stop to feed the noise. She had something else in her bag, a draft bill, one she'd quietly co-authored with staffers from both rural and urban districts. A rare piece of legislation designed to link community trauma support between neglected city centers and underserved farming counties. A mental health bridge, a housing pilot, a small start, but one built on the truth that her voice had carved into the national conscience. By midnight, major outlets were calling it the Crockett Hollow Bill. Unofficial, unverified, but real. The next morning, she arrived early to her office and found a stack of messages from voters in red districts saying something she'd never expected. "We don't always agree with your party, but we believe you." She pinned one message to her wall, not because it was poetic, but because it was simple. It read, "You spoke, and for once, they couldn't talk over you." And in the quiet that followed Washington's reaction, the headlines fading, the cameras cooling, the voices of praise and protest beginning to blur, what remained was something deeper, something heavier, something human. Jasmine Crockett had not set out to go viral. She had set out to tell the truth, and what she discovered in the aftermath was that truth has a price, but it also has a purpose. The deeper lesson was not just in what she exposed about policy or politics. It was in what she revealed about the way power responds when someone without it dares to speak in language stripped of fear. And that lesson didn't live on the Senate floor or in trending clips. It lived in what happened next, in the conversations her words sparked in classrooms, barbershops, laundromats, churches, and crowded city buses. It lived in the look of a mother who finally saw herself in someone on the Hill. It lived in the silence of men who had long used morality as armor, now forced to sit with what it looked like when morality looked back. What Crockett showed the country was simple and impossible to unsee, that injustice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers when a child is told the school library is closed again because there's no money this year. It whispers when a veteran waits 6 months for housing assistance while watching campaign ads promise honor. It whispers when a teenager skips school, not because she doesn't care, but because her younger siblings need someone to watch them while their mother works a double shift. These aren't failures of character. They're failures of will. Policy doesn't just dictate spending, it dictates dignity. And the cruelest part of injustice is not that it hurts, it's that it teaches those who endure it to believe they somehow deserved it. That's the lie Crockett shattered. By refusing to flinch, by refusing to apologize for surviving the very system now judging her community, she forced a national reckoning, not just with budgets, but with belief. She held up a mirror to the country and asked the question we rarely dare to answer out loud. Who gets to be broken and forgiven, and who gets to be punished for being broken at all? Her words weren't just policy critiques. They were a rejection of the hierarchy of empathy, where pain is only validated when it comes from a zip code that votes the right way, or a face that fits the mold of respectable struggle. And when she said, "I don't speak for the poor, I am them," she wasn't making a rhetorical flourish. She was making a demand that every single person erased by data points be named, heard, and counted. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.